Fort Ball, New York State, 1756. Black, heavy clouds obscure the sky as you creep over the crisp, freshly fallen snow, heading towards the wooden fort up ahead. You are a French militiaman, about to strike a blow against the hated roast beefs, the arrogant English. You sneak towards the open gate, when suddenly a voice screams out, "The French are coming! We're under attack!" Mardi! So much for the element of surprise. You start running, trying to close the remaining distance before they can react, but the fort's gates slam shut just before you reach them. But then you spot the gun holes in the wooden walls, and an idea springs into your head. Sticking your musket through the hole, you can see the chaos among the defenders inside. A red-coated soldier is running towards you until he spots the musket sticking out at him. Before he can react, you pull the trigger, and he falls to the floor with a surprised look on his face. Your comrades copy your tactic, targeting the defenders, turning the inside of the fort into a shooting gallery. You spot a militiaman racing for cover and fire, seeing him nosedive into the dirt. With the defenders pinned down, a call goes up from your officer. "We need men for the battering ram." Battering ram? Where did they get one of those? Then you see they have found a fallen tree. French ingenuity at its best. Taking your place, you crash the tree into the gates, once, twice, and then on the third hit, the gate crashes open. A shout of huzzah goes up as you storm into the fort, slaughtering the remaining defenders and looting the camp. You're just relieving a dead officer of his silver pocket watch. Well, he won't need it anymore. When you smell burning, looking around, you spot that the British gunpowder store is on fire. You have to get out of here. Panicked Frenchmen pour out of the fort, faster than they came in. You have just got through the gates when a huge explosion and a burst of scorching hot flame throws you into the air. I'm your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Da wird uns ausgebeten. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. In the last episode, we saw how North America was divided between the great superpowers of their time, France and Britain. As squabbles on the frontier turned into bloodshed, Britain launched a huge campaign to finally drive the French from North America. Instead, it ended in the humiliating disaster of Braddock's defeat. As the war spreads across the world, Britain and her colonists must now fight for their very lives, as the French go all out for total victory. When word of Braddock's defeat spread to the colonies, and then across the Atlantic to London, it provoked panic and dismay. Almost everyone had thought this would be an easy operation, that the redcoats would be unbeatable against mere natives and a few French regulars. Now, all those cosy assumptions had been shattered. In the glaring light of reality, the frontier was now wide open for the French to advance. Tribes allied to Paris began attacking British settlements. Fleeing refugees brought terrible tales of massacres, torture, and scalpings. Morale took a further beating when the 3 other offensives launched alongside Braddock's expedition had highly mixed results. The first 2 were launched in what is now New York State. Their aim was to control the Hudson River corridor, which ran like a military superhighway through the war zone. Remember, this is still a period when going by water is a hell of a lot faster than going by land. With that in mind, the rivers here were both an opportunity and a threat to both sides. The British feared the French could sail down from Montreal, catch Albany, and then drive on New York City itself, cutting their colonies in 2. The French, on the other hand, feared that if the British gained dominance on the rivers, then their lifeline to New Orleans and the south would be cut. These rivers are going to run red with blood before this war is done. Massachusetts Governor William Shirley was another bad-tempered individual who could pick a fight in an empty room. It's almost as if such men were deliberately being sent to the far frontiers of the Empire just to get them out of Britain. I'm sure it's just a coincidence. Under Braddock's plan, he was to lead an army to capture the French strongpoint of Fort Niagara on Lake Ontario. However, Shirley was more interested in squabbling with the leader of the second offensive coming from New York, William Johnson. He spent his time whining to London and anyone who would listen that Johnson was competing with him for supplies and recruits, exceeding his authority and turning the Indians against him. Eventually setting out after much delay, he was also revealed not to be the best of organisers. His logistics broke down immediately, and soon his men were starving, not helped by the colonists refusing to pay for anything. Then news came in that Braddock was dead, making Shirley the temporary commander-in-chief of British forces in North America. Puffing up his feathers like a peacock, Shirley declared his campaign was no longer worthy of his time, now he was generalissimo, and retreated back the way he had come. So ended the glorious Niagara campaign. With 2 failures already, Britain was very much on the back foot. The French might have forged an unbreakable chain from Canada in the north to Louisiana in the south, binding the English to the Atlantic seacoast. That they didn't was down to one man, Shirley's great rival, William Johnson. To most British settlers, the Indians were forest devils, deserving neither pity nor justice. William Johnson saw them as human beings. He arrived in the New World in 1738 with 12 Irish Protestant families to establish a settlement. To the shock of all, he treated the Indians fairly, paying them the true worth of their furs and selling them quality goods at reasonable prices. He even learned their language, slept in their camps, ate their food, and when in time he was adopted into the Mohawk tribe, painted his face and danced their dances. He became an exceptionally wealthy man and was beloved by the Native Americans, especially the Iroquois. He even married a Mohawk princess. It was solely due to his influence that not all of the Indian tribes switched to the French after Braddock's defeat. Now he was charged with capturing Fort St. Frederick on Lake Champlain, near the Canadian border. If it fell to the British, the French would be bottled up in Montreal. Still, it was a tall order for Johnson. He had no previous military experience, and his force was truly a ragtag one. He had 3,000 provincial militiamen from New England and New York, farm boys, mechanics, and labourers, wearing what clothes they had from home. Soldiers only by the grace of the guns they carried. Johnson's men were undisciplined, and elected their own officers. They resented being trained to fight like a European army, preferring to fight like the Native Americans. One New Englander later recalled, quote, "It greatly surprised me to think I must stand still to be shot at." End quote. To be fair, he had a good point. They resented each other as well. To New Yorkers, their Yankee brethren were sanctimonious prigs, while pious New Englanders were horrified at the New Yorkers for carousing with prostitutes, getting drunk and cursing like sailors. Colonel Ephraim Williams of Massachusetts complained, quote, "We are a wicked and profane army, more especially the New York troops, who speak only the language of hell." End quote. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Johnson cautiously led his ragtag army northward, and it was slow going as they cut their way through a forest thickly carpeted with old growth trees and choked with underbrush, all in the full glare of the August sun. Reaching the southernmost point of Lake St. Sacrament, he cheekily renamed it Lake George after Britain's king. He laid out a temporary camp here, awaiting reinforcements. A more experienced commander would have shuddered at the site he had picked, which had swamps on both sides and the lake in the rear, barring retreat. It was something of a death trap, but Johnson wasn't expecting to be attacked. However, the French knew all about his mission from Braddock's captured official papers. The Baron de Dieskar was heading straight for him with 1,100 Frenchmen and 700 Indians. Thanks to the information provided by a defector, the Baron found out that Johnson was sending men to reinforce the nearby Fort Edward, and he set a trap, with his men hiding in the undergrowth alongside the road. 800 colonial militia under Colonel Ephraim Williams and 200 Mohawks under Old Hendrick, the most faithful of the Mohawk chiefs, walked straight into it, suddenly engulfed in a blaze of enemy musketry. The Battle of Lake George had begun. The slaughter that followed became known as the Bloody Morning Scout. Colonel Williams was killed, and Old Hendrick fell mortally wounded. The colonial militia suffered 50 killed and 22 wounded, while the Mohawk lost some 30 warriors. Casualties would have been higher, but for the steady courage of the Mohawks, who skillfully covered the retreat. As it was, panic-stricken survivors ran into the main camp. One eyewitness recalled, quote, "with all the marks of horror and fear in their countenances, exaggerating the number of the enemy." End quote. The Baron stood on the verge of total victory, but his militia and Indian allies were more interested in looting and scalping than pursuing the fleeing men. He lost vital time trying to restore discipline. By the time Dieskar got his troops in order, Johnson had improvised some defences for his exposed camp, made out of logs, overturned carts and boats, hauled in from the lake shore. Many of the militiamen had gone into hiding after the bloody scout, but perhaps 1,700 rallied to Johnson's call. The Baron attacked at once, even though many of his Indians and French Canadians balked at assaulting a entrenched position, bristling with cannons. Undeterred, Dieskar spearheaded his offensive with 220 grenadiers, regular soldiers who could be called upon to launch an almost suicidal attack without flinching. They formed 3 white lines, and then in slow clockwork motion advanced towards the camp, one line firing and then dropping back to reload, while the next line took its place. It was a terrifying sight for the colonials, but through sheer force of will, Johnson kept them from fleeing. The gleaming ranks of white-uniformed French regulars, with their peaked caps, black gaiters, and shining bayonets, fills your heart with pride as you stand before the English fort. The Indians and colonials cower in the bush, refusing to attack, but now they will see what the best soldiers in Europe can do. As one you advance, your officers shouting out, "For France and for the King!" British musket fire erupts, and a wall of lead smashes into your ranks. Blood splatters onto your face and stains your white uniform. The soldier next to you has taken a headshot and slides down to the floor, a bemused expression on his face. Still you advance, just as you have been trained to. But then the British cannons start firing. The battlefield is soon filled with thick smoke as you march blindly onwards, the cannon shots that emerge from the cloud performing a most terrible execution. Cannonballs plough into the ranks to your left, disemboweling and lopping off limbs with horrifying ease. A wounded Frenchman lies screaming on the ground without his right leg. Still you press on, though there are now large gaps in the formerly perfect white lines, like teeth missing in a comb, and blood-stained figures sprawled across the stumps. You feel a sharp pain on your cheek. A musket ball has barely missed your head. Instead, you taste the sour metallic flavour of blood as it runs into your mouth. Finally, it's just too much, and you retreat back. Your officer roaring, "Back in line, and prepare to advance again!" Dieskar was wounded twice, once in the bladder, and had to be propped up against a tree. Johnson was shot in the thigh. After 4 hours of carnage, the French regulars finally broke and fled the battlefield, pursued by whooping Mohawks and cheering Yankee farmers. The Baron was left behind by his men. Fearing he would be scalped, he reached into his pocket for his watch to trade it for his life. But an English soldier, fearing he was drawing a gun, shot him again. The 3 times wounded Dieskar was amazingly still alive, and he was spared a scalping thanks to Johnson. He had become a British prisoner until being exchanged in 1763. Meanwhile, forces down at Fort Edward had also heard the fighting happening to the north, and sent a force of 220 militia in a relief column under Captain William McGinnis of the New York regiments and Nathan Folsom of the New Hampshire regiments. The New Yorkers and the New Englanders were constantly fighting at Fort Edward, and the animosity continued during the march. The New Hampshire regiment reportedly complained that the New Yorkers were too slow, but didn't want to pass them, as they claimed they were more afraid of the New Yorkers than they were of the enemy. As they marched north, they ran slap bang into a large force of Indian warriors and Canadian militiamen, who were busy looting the dead bodies of those killed in the bloody morning scout. A 4-hour firefight raged on until they fled. So many of the Baron's men had been killed that when their dead bodies were thrown into a nearby pool, it turned red. Ever after, it was called the Bloody Pond. Putting aside their differences for 1 minute, the colonists feasted on captured French brandy and bread. For the British, there was a victory at last. On the shore of Lake George, an amateur general leading amateur soldiers had defeated the mighty French regulars, avenging Braddock's defeat. If the French had won, they could have conquered all the way to Albany. There was little to stop them. It would also have a great effect on the colonists. It was the arrogant British regulars under Braddock who had suffered a terrible defeat. It was the colonial militias who had saved the day. Johnson had saved British America from being penned in, but for now he wouldn't be able to complete his original mission. The Mohawks, shocked at their losses, went home, and so did many of his militiamen, now they'd actually experienced combat. There was no way he could advance to Fort St. Frederick now. Instead, he'll remain at Lake George, the front line stabilizing here for now, as the 2 sides licked their wounds. So far, the score is 1 bad defeat, 1 dab squib, and 1 victory for the British. But none of these 3 offences had achieved any of their objectives. The 4th offensive, though, would be a small success. Rather than the American frontier, this campaign was focused on the Atlantic French colony of Arcadia. It was highly strategic, as it contained the port of Louisbourg, linking New France and Canada with the homeland. Today this area is Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and part of the state of Maine, but in 1755 it was divided up between the British and the French after the War of Spanish Succession, known as Queen Anne's War in the New World. The problem was, the borders were not clear, with British settlers clashing with French Arcadians and their Indian allies. The British plan was to capture Fort Beauséjour, cutting off Louisbourg from the rest of New France. This was actually going to be easier than they expected, thanks to the endemic corruption of the officials in Arcadia. The fort's commander, Louis Dupont du Chambon de Vergor, was incredibly corrupt. His own secretary would later call him, quote, avaricious in the extreme, end quote. He was skimping on the defences, cutting every corner possible, and pocketing the cash. By the time the British arrived, the fort was badly provisioned, the defenders' pay was in arrears, and vital maintenance work hadn't been completed. Luckily for the French, Vergor at least had the heart of a lion. The cowardly lion, from the Wizard of Oz, that is. After 1 British cannonball hit the fort, he panicked and surrendered. Arcadia was now in British hands, and Louisbourg was cut off from the interior. The success was marred, however, by an appalling war crime, thanks to one William Shirley. Now temporary commander of all British forces in North America, he decided that the Arcadians could not be trusted, especially as they refused to swear loyalty to the king. His solution was ethnic cleansing. The Acadians were called to meetings in their churches and then arrested en masse. Those that escaped or smelt a rat were driven out by British troops burning their farms. 11,000 Acadians were eventually expelled, 75% of their population, and scattered throughout the British colonies. 5,000 would die from disease and ill treatment during the removal. Eventually, most of them fled to Louisiana. Here, the Acadians built a new society in the heat of the South, their name gradually changing from Acadians to Cajuns. Yep, this is how Cajun culture started in the South. It remains a forgotten crime of empire outside the Cajuns themselves. Really, it wasn't even necessary. Most Acadians accepted British occupation with a few grumbles. The great plan conceived by Braddock to drive the French from North America had failed. Britain had suffered the worst of the fighting, mainly due to Braddock's defeat, but essentially it was a stalemate. Really, the whole plan had been too ambitious. Britain didn't have the resources to achieve it, especially with the colonies showing lukewarm support. 1756 would start off quietly on the frontier as the two sides licked their wounds, but it would end with a bang. American historians tend to treat the French and Indian War as separate from the 7-Year War that was about to be officially declared, but this doesn't make a lot of sense. The conflict that was about to rage across the world was all interconnected. It's rather like treating the Pacific theatre of World War II as entirely separate from the fighting in Europe and North Africa. It doesn't really make sense. As Britain clashed with France in the New World, Europe was going through the so-called diplomatic revolution. While the Anglo-French rivalry is justifiably famous, if you asked a French policymaker in 1750 who their number one enemy was, they would have said the Habsburgs of the Austrian Empire. In each war that battered Europe, you could be sure that France and Austria would be on opposing sides. This had been true for over 200 years. But now, everything was going to change. In the last great European conflict, the War of Spanish Succession, Austria had lost the valuable province of Silesia to an upstart rival, Prussia. Its position as top dog among the German states was threatened. Empress Maria Theresa wanted Silesia back with a burning passion, and she wasn't going to get any support from Britain for this. So she did the unthinkable. She allied with the former hated rival of France. Prussia knew war was coming, so they allied with Britain. This was the diplomatic revolution, the complete change of alliances among the European powers. The 7 Years' War officially began in 1756. On one side was France, Austria, Russia, and later Spain. On the other, Britain, Prussia, and Portugal. In Europe, Prussia, under Frederick the Great, took on the combined might of France, Austria, and Russia, with help from a large British army and even larger subsidies. Miraculously, the legendary general held them off. As fighting raged in Europe, it soon became a true world war. As well as the fighting in North America, battles were being fought in Africa, the Pacific, the Caribbean, and even India. As Britain was tied down elsewhere, France started to advance again in North America. This was mainly due to the changing of the guard among the French commanders. The Marquis de Montcalm had arrived. Brave and highly skilled, he was a veteran of numerous campaigns, having been shot, stabbed, and held captive for a year. Pint-sized and pugnacious, it was said that the Indians, in particular, were amazed that such charisma could emanate from a man of such short stature. He was about the most dangerous enemy Britain would ever face in its 70-year struggle against the French in North America. Montcalm decided to attack the British where they were weakest, right on the edges of the frontier. The Great Lakes were dominated by France at this time, except for one British possession on Lake Ontario, Fort Oswego. This small fort had annoyed the French for years, and it was right at the edge of Britain's supply lines, ripe for the plucking. There was a line of small forts linking Oswego to Albany, protecting its supply route, and it was one of these that was targeted first by the French. In early 1756, it had been a terrible winter. Extremely cold, dark skies and heavy snow. The garrison at Fort Bull was on half rations and racked with disease. They couldn't keep fresh vegetables and fruit in these forts, so their diet was mainly hardtack, salted pork and bread. Unsurprisingly, scurvy became a major problem as well. Morale was at rock bottom when the French attacked and took the defenders completely by surprise. As we saw in the opening dramatization, it had an explosive finale. The supply route to Oswego was badly disrupted and never quite returned to normal. Oswego was garrisoned by 1,000 soldiers and 600 civilians, commanded by Colonel James Mercer, and all was not well. His soldiers, not the best to begin with, had nearly starved to death over the winter, and many had died from scurvy. The survivors were sullen and angry, almost to the point of mutiny. The post consisted of Fort Oswego itself and two smaller stockades nearby, Fort Ontario and the unfinished Fort George. Their wooden walls could never withstand a determined siege. Taken by surprise, the horrified garrison could only look on as 3,000 French troops and Indian warriors appeared, backed by plentiful artillery. Fort Ontario was abandoned straight away, with the British taking shelter in Fort Oswego, which was soon facing 12 French cannons. Relentlessly pounded by the artillery and raked by musket fire, the defenders were doomed. When a cannon shell struck and beheaded poor Mercer, his second-in-command was so unnerved that he surrendered the fort within an hour after assuming command. In just 4 days, Montcalm had destroyed the British position on Lake Ontario with minimal French casualties. It was one of the greatest French victories of the war. The aftermath, however, stained Montcalm's victory laurels. French allied Indians broke into the fort, got blind drunk on rum, and went berserk, pillaging and killing without mercy. About 100 British prisoners, including many sick and wounded, were murdered before order was restored. Montcalm was distressed by the events, and did his best to gloss over them. He was a newcomer to America, he said, and not used to the conventions of Indian warfare. However, stories of Oswego spread far and wide, encouraging Indian warriors to enlist in the next campaign. Indian men went to war for prestige and profit. They wanted something to show for the hardships and dangers they faced. Scalps and plunder were visible tokens of success, tangible tokens of intangible virtues, such as courage and skill in battle. Captives, too, were sought, because they could either be adopted to make up for tribal losses, tortured to death in revenge, or ransomed for a tidy profit. A warrior who came home empty-handed was a fool worthy of contempt, a disgrace to his manhood. Though the massacre at Oswego hadn't been intentional, it became the greatest recruiting tool the French ever had among the tribes. As 1,700 Brits walked off into captivity, and the captured fort was burnt to the ground, New England farmers slept uneasily in their beds, wondering just how far this new French advance would go. By this time, Shirley had been recalled after upsetting too many people. His replacement was an aristocratic nonentity called Lord London. Ironically, as many things in America are still named after him, he was incredibly unpopular with the colonists. Americans had commerce running through their veins even then, and were openly trading with the French in the middle of a war. Furious with the colonists, London decided to show them who was boss. He closed all the ports temporarily. The colonial traders threw a fit, and he was forced to open them again. He also tried to officer the militias with British regulars and interfere with the power of the colonial legislatures, both of which went down like a lead balloon. The colonists would never forget his heavy-handed treatment. The seeds that would lead to the American Revolution are just beginning to be sown. Militarily, he was something of a disaster, as he was racked by indecision. He's the kind of guy who and ahed about every decision. Definitely not someone known for decisive action. Benjamin Franklin claimed, quote, "He is like St. George on the tavern signs, always on horseback, and never rides on." End quote. He was meant to be launching an offensive to seize Louisburg and cutting off French access to the Atlantic, but he was making glacially slow progress in getting ready to set out. As Britain's best troops in North America were twiddling their thumbs on the coast with nothing to do, the frontier forts and settlements were left vulnerable. The eagle-eyed Montcalm spotted this opportunity and was only too happy to take advantage. He had wanted to destroy the British presence at Lake George for a long time, and now was his chance. After the French defeat in 1755, the lake was effectively a no-man's land between the two sides. On the lake's northern shore, the French had built Fort Ticonderoga. It was actually called Carillon at this time, but that will change when the British eventually capture it. To avoid confusion, I'm using the British name in this series. On the southern shore, William Johnson's old camp was now Fort William Henry. The fort was well constructed, built along the latest European lines, featuring 4 diamond-shaped bastions, bristling with cannons. The walls were 30 feet thick, consisting of packed beach sand faced by logs. The log and sand combination was especially designed to absorb the impact of cannonballs, although the fort would still be vulnerable to mortar fire lobbed over the walls. Despite its sophistication, it had a few weaknesses. Sanitary conditions were primitive at best, with one solitary outhouse privy at the northwest corner of the fort. Lacking the discipline of the regulars, the colonials were dirty and slovenly, and diseases like smallpox soon raged through the camp. Diarrhea was also very common. That must have been murder with only one privy available. Imagine the queues. The French had tried to capture it in March 1757, a virtually forgotten attack now, thanks to the bloodshed that would happen in August. 1,500 French soldiers and Indian allies walked over the frozen lake towards William Henry, a huge force for this theatre of the war. They had no artillery to batter down the walls, but they did have lots of ladders to scale the walls. This meant that they were very reliant on achieving complete surprise. If the garrison was alerted, their soldiers would be sitting ducks on all those ladders. At first, everything seemed to be going their way. The fort had only 400 defenders, and about a third of them were sick from the long winter. It's also the day after St. Patrick's Day, and there were a lot of Irishmen among the garrison, so they were all hung over. The French seemed to hold all the cards. But things started to unravel pretty fast. They were spotted by a sentry crossing the frozen lake. The hungover defenders clambered out of bed and, bleary-eyed, headed to the walls. The French commander now lost his confidence, and he decided not to attack the fort. Instead, he just went on a burning spree. It was a pyromaniac's wet dream. They burnt every building outside the fort, 4 vessels, and over 300 bateaux, all larger than normal canoes. When they had burnt enough, the French headed home. Both sides claimed victory, but in reality it was a damp squib for all concerned. But it had important consequences that would benefit Montcalm. With the loss of their ships, the British couldn't launch any offences on the lake any time soon. Worst of all, the bateaux had been used for spying and scouting missions, but now they were charcoal. The British were blinded intelligence-wise. They had no idea what the French were up to. In the months building up to the siege of Fort William Henry, Montcalm prepared the ground well. War belts were circulated among the local Native American tribes to announce the upcoming offensives. With 2,000 Indians eagerly joining the French, Montcalm was a confirmed winner, and the tribes have heard rumours that the fort was swimming in loot and brandy. Indian raids began to cut off the fort's supply routes and terrorise local settlements. Soon the whole area was a war zone between the Indians and Rogers' Rangers. It was a brutal struggle, raid and counter-raid, atrocity and counter-atrocity. Now, Rogers' Rangers are a fascinating story. Frontiersmen trained to fight like Native Americans. The original American Special Forces units. I will go into them more next episode. For now, Fort William Henry was increasingly isolated. Montcalm's Indian allies were certainly useful, but he was increasingly fed up with them. He was a general who had spent most of his life fighting in Europe. He was used to strict discipline enforced by brutal punishments, of commanding the soldiers who followed his orders to the letter, or else. Instead, the Native Americans barely listened to him, did what they felt like doing, and drove him crazy. Behind closed doors, he ranted about the so-called, quote, painted savages, end quote. Their treatment of prisoners was already staining his reputation, something he really resented. He had to personally stop the Indians from forcing a British prisoner to run a gauntlet of jeering warriors armed with tomahawks and blades. He then found out another allied tribe was practicing ritual cannibalism with the rest of the prisoners. When appalled Montcalm tried to stop them, they threw a fit, claiming they'd only joined the French because he had a reputation for allowing looting and atrocities. If he stopped their fun, they would leave. Eventually, Montcalm solved this by purchasing the remaining prisoners, claiming he wanted them as slaves. None of this was actually his fault, but rumours of this are spreading all over the frontier. He's becoming a devil-like figure to the British. As Montcalm squabbled with his cannibals, the British were getting nervous back at Fort William Henry. Its commander, Lieutenant Colonel George Monroe, had never seen combat before, but he was no fool. He knew something was in the wind, and was determined to find out what. He decided to send 350 men under Colonel Parker in some of the canoes they had rebuilt to Sabbath Day Point on the west of Lake George. Their mission was to spy on the French, and it was going to be a disaster. The 3 canoes carrying the advance party were captured by the French without a shot being fired. Threatened of being handed over to the cannibal tribe, the prisoners unsurprisingly squealed everything they knew about Monroe's plans. A very warm welcome was now awaiting Parker's men. The only sounds are the gentle splashing of your oars as your small fleet of canoes emerges out of the inky blackness of night on the frontier. You're on a scouting mission to spy on the French and their Indian allies, and so far everything has gone according to plan. The first wave of canoes have reached the shore, and their crews disembark, signalling that everything is safe. Then, suddenly, the darkness is lit up by the flash of musket fire. Many of the soldiers on the shore fall. The rest desperately search for cover. Parker yells out, "Turn around! It's an ambush!" As you try to escape into the vastness of the lake, you find to your horror you're now surrounded by Indian canoes. You're caught like rats in a trap as they leap into the water and head towards you, their tomahawks and spears gleaming. The canoe next to you is capsized, and the soldiers inside, frozen with fear, tumble into the water, where they are hacked to death by the warriors. Coming to your senses, you shoot an Indian approaching your canoe, and hit another in the head with your rifle butt. The rest of your comrades shake off their own fear and frantically fight back. All around you are the screams of the dying and wounded men as the water runs red with blood. Your canoe has reached the shore, but an Indian charges towards you, swinging his tomahawk. You parry with your musket and grapple with him in the surf, when a shot rings out and he slides into the water. You see that it's Parker that has saved you, and he yells out to those who remain, "We'll have to fight our way into the forest to escape. Come on, men!" Dodging French musket balls and being chased by whooping Indians, you flee into the dark forest. The terrified soldiers were completely overwhelmed. Out of Parker's original force of 350, nearly 160 drowned or were killed. The remainder were taken prisoner, except for roughly 100 Brits who fought their way out and escaped with Parker back to Fort William Henry. Loaded with prisoners and plunder, the French soldiers and Indian warriors got rip-roaring drunk on rum and marched back home singing all the way. That one cannibal tribe begged to eat the prisoners, but Montcalm would only let them pick one. The unlucky soldier was boiled alive and eaten as a great delicacy. That's when you know you're unlucky. It was a perfect time to strike, and Montcalm wasn't going to miss it. On August the 2nd, Montcalm's army appeared on the lake, ferried by 250 French boats and 150 Indian canoes, a huge armada that seemed to fill the horizon. And this wasn't even the whole army. About a third of them marched on the west shore of Lake George rather than travelling by boat. The French landed without opposition, and soon Fort William Henry was surrounded. The British defenders were outnumbered 4-1, and smallpox was ravaging the garrison. The situation was dire for them as the siege began. The Indian warriors would play an important role, but when all was said and done, the attack against Fort William Henry would be a European affair fought by European professionals using standard European methods of siege warfare. In the 18th century, big battles were rare, maybe one a year at most. Sieges were far more common, so common in fact, there was even a standardized process for waging a siege. The legendary military engineer, the Marquis de Vauban, is most famous today for the fortresses he built, but his greatest innovations were all in how to blow them apart. His mantra of more powder, less blood had become the rule, making sieges strangely formal affairs. First was the obvious one. The army must surround the fortress to cut off supplies. Next, trenches called parallels would be dug. They would run parallel to the fort's walls to protect troops from defensive fire, and was zigzagged to prevent defenders from firing down the length of the trench. With the trenches in place, artillery brought up, and it began pounding the walls. Once a sufficient breach was made in the walls, called the Forlorn Hope, a group of volunteers did a final, often bloody assault. Death was almost guaranteed. If you survived, it was automatic promotion. If done properly, it was almost a guaranteed way to win a siege. For the defenders, there were elaborate rituals they had to follow as well. A first request to surrender must always be rejected. Surrendering too early would invite contempt from friend and foe alike, and could lead to the commander's execution. They must resist until a hole big enough for the enemy infantry to get through was created. Only then could they begin surrender negotiations. If the garrison held out until a breach was made, they were often granted the honours of war. This allowed the defenders to march out with colours flying, drums beating, and to be escorted to their nearest friendly lines, rather than being taken prisoner. This was how the upcoming siege would be waged, European style. As the French began digging their trenches, the fort's cannons, especially on the northeast bastion, did all they could to harass the diggers and delay construction of the siege lines. The southeast bastion was also busy, blasting salvos at the Indians, who continually sniped at the fort with musket fire. During a lull in the fighting, Montcalm formally sent a message to Monroe under a flag of truce. A blood-red banner was used, so as not to confuse a flag of truce with the French national colours. Montcalm's letter was a masterpiece of formal courtesy and veiled threats, promising, quote, "I have it yet in my power to restrain the savages and oblige them to observe a capitulation," end quote. Actually, Montcalm didn't, and it would lead to a tragedy. Monroe rejected it, as any self-respecting defender should at this stage. The next 2 or 3 days were grim ones for the beleaguered garrison. The British camp saw its fair share of action, exchanging musket fire with swarming Indian warriors. Several sorties managed to push the natives back, but once the garrison returned to camp, the Indians emerged and began their musket fire all over again. It took several days for French cannons and mortars to be offloaded from rafts and manhandled up to the siege lines, but by August the 6th, all was ready. The French artillery opened fire, while the fort's guns flamed in counter-battery. Red, yellow flame and clouds of grey powder smoke belched from the opposing cannons, whose thunderous blasts kicked the audience back on their trails with each report. French mortar shells shot high into the sky and came down with a deadly accuracy. When a lucky French shot carried away the fort's flagstaff, a carpenter rushed forward to effect repairs. A moment later, that poor carpenter's head was taken off by a cannonball, leaving only a flailing corpse whose shattered neck sprayed jets of blood, like something from a horror film. Monroe sent frantic messages to Fort Edward begging for help, but its commander, Daniel Webb, was reluctant to do anything. He would later claim that he felt the fort was going to fall anyway, and that he must husband his resources so he could protect New York and Albany. Both at the time and now, though, many felt these were just excuses to hide his own cowardice. On August the 4th, Webb sent 3 Rangers with a message to Monroe, but the trio were ambushed by an Indian warrior who killed and scalped one of the Rangers and took a second prisoner. The third man managed to escape into the woods. The warrior returned to Montcalm in triumph, proudly handing over the letter, which was stained with the courier's blood. Webb's message was a pessimistic one, exaggerating the numbers in the French army and telling Monroe frankly that no reinforcements or help were coming. His only advice was try and get the best terms he could from the French. Webb's behaviour would later be condemned, with William Johnson bitterly denouncing him as, quote, "the only Englishman I ever knew who was a coward," end quote. Montcalm was a master of psychological warfare. Before he sent Webb's letter to be delivered, the Marquess decided that the British must be softened up with a heavy bombardment. On August the 7th, the French batteries opened up with 17 cannons, 2 mortars and 2 howitzers, a storm of metal that caused the very ground to shake and the air to rumble with unnatural thunder. After 3 hours of heavy punishment, Montcalm called a ceasefire and sent an envoy to Monroe under a flag of truce. The French messenger carried Webb's letter, which he hand-delivered to the doughty Scots colonel. Despite the disheartening message, Monroe still refused to discuss surrender, and the siege dragged on. The next day, the British were greeted by an unpleasant sight, a new trench line that edged around the fort's garden and was only 320 yards from the walls. In the last few days, William Henry's guns had given a good account of themselves, but constant firing was producing metal fatigue. One by one the guns burst, reducing their firepower. Ammunition and supplies were also running low. Monroe and his men had held out the best they could, but the end was now in sight. It was either surrender or be destroyed. Monroe chose surrender. Montcalm's terms were predicted to be generous. The garrison would not be taken prisoner. On the contrary, they'd be allowed to go back to Fort Edward with full honours of war. The troops serving at Fort William Henry were required to give their parole, basically their word that they would not fight the French for another 18 months. In token of their brave defence, the garrison would be able to take 1 cannon with them as well. It was all in keeping with the established rules of civilized European warfare. By signing the capitulation, Montcalm totally ignored the customs of his Indian allies. The general assembled the chiefs from the various tribes and told them for interpreters that they must honour the terms of the surrender. This is where the problems started to arise. First of all, many of these tribes were new to the French experience, and they didn't have any translators skilled in their languages. They were communicating by gestures and vague hand movements. Though the French tried to make them understand, it was rather hard to explain complex European siege etiquette. Those chiefs who could understand a word the French were saying did agree to restrain their young men. But here, Montcalm didn't understand that chiefs in Indian society were figures with little real power. They could try and set an example, they could cajole or admonish, but no warrior was required to obey them. Those very warriors were currently frustrated, angry, and feeling betrayed. The French were placing restrictions on what they could loot and plunder, and the British weren't meant to be molested as they retreated? What kind of craziness was this? The atmosphere was a smouldering tinderbox of anger and resentment that threatened to burst into flame at any moment. As the fort was being surrendered, thousands of Indians poured inside and headed straight for the rum stores. That was never a good sign. Soon they were drunk as skunks and went berserk. They burst into the hospital and began killing and scalping the sick and wounded in their very beds. Shouts of help and murder could be heard as Indians fell on their helpless victims, horrifying the French and British. One of the victims was decapitated, and his killer was seen carrying the head around with him and showing it off as a trophy. In their frenzy, and not content with live victims, rampaging Native Americans swept into the cemetery and began digging up British and American corpses of those who had died during the siege. From the Indian point of view, there were scalps to be had, and a corpse's red coat made an attractive trophy. Unfortunately for the Indians, their greed proved their undoing. Many of those buried were people who had died of smallpox. Warriors who gleefully dug up bodies carried smallpox germs back to their home villages. A massive smallpox epidemic was soon spread throughout the Great Lakes area, devastating the tribes. Overall, it was a horrifying portent of what was to come. In an effort to prevent a massacre, Monroe, with Montcalm's approval, decided to march to Fort Edward at midnight. Then, perhaps, the British and the American colonials could escape under the cover of darkness. Unfortunately, the Indians were suspicious of just such a trick, and they had scouts waiting for them in the darkness. When the scouts were spotted, they called off the whole operation. Monroe bowed to the inevitable and agreed to an early morning departure instead. The British spent a sleepless night hoping for the dawn, yet dreading what the early morning might bring. When dawn finally broke, Monroe's 35th Foot and the Royal Artillery led a vanguard out of the encampment, the procession accompanied by a small French escort. The Indians immediately began to appear on the fringe in ever-increasing numbers, boldly coming up to the redcoats and stripping packs, clothing and weapons from them with absolute impunity. The British regulars were comparatively lucky. A few were stripped of their outer clothing, and their possessions were plundered, but on the whole they escaped relatively intact. Back at the encampment, the colonial militia troops and the civilians would fare much worse. Warriors ran into the camp, dragged out some of the wounded, and hacked them to death in full view of their horrified comrades. British Indians in the colonial ranks were seized and dragged off to an unknown, but likely hideous fate. African Americans were also taken out of the ranks and claimed as property by the Indians, who cared little if they were legally free or not. By the time it was the colonials' turn to march out, order was rapidly breaking down. The air is thick with tension as you march out of the encampment, the jolly music of the regimental band failing to dim the sense of menace as the Indians watch you pass. Many are already brandishing trophies they've seized from the soldiers in the vanguard, red coats, hats and muskets. Now they're hungrily eyeing your own possessions. Some begin running up and down the column, grabbing whatever they please. Some of the colonials try to fight back, but are driven off with tomahawks or clubbed to the ground. Then they begin to carry off people too. A screaming woman is dragged off by two warriors. Her husband lies dead on the floor. You shout out to the small party of French soldiers nearby. "You must stop this! Montcalm promised us safe passage." They ignore you, looking scared themselves. You're trying to hurry the column along when an Indian grabs your musket. You refuse to let it go and wrestle him for it. The warrior shouts angry at you in his own language. You reply, "Get your hands off my gun, you heathen!" In the struggle, it goes off. There is silence for a second, and then the terrible sound of war whoops fills the air. En masse, the Native Americans descend upon the helpless column. Chaos reigned as tomahawks bit into skulls. the blows accompanied by the sickening thuds as metal dug into human flesh and bone. Those who weren't killed were seized and carried off. Montcalm desperately tried to stop the massacre, riding his horse through the chaos, shouting, quote, "Kill me, but spare the English, who are under my protection." End quote. He was ignored until French regulars with bayonets drawn drove his Indian allies away. 185 British and colonials were killed outright. 500 were captured and taken away. Many were never seen again. Fort William Henry was burnt to the ground. It would lay in ruins for over 200 years. The massacre at the fort created a sensation in the British colonies, and tales of the atrocity grew worse with each retelling. It soon became an accepted fact that 1,500 people had been brutally slaughtered. Montcalm was blamed for the atrocity, the butcher of Oswego striking again. Eyewitnesses reported him even riding amongst the Indians and inciting them to kill. While we know this was untrue, it was a stain that would forever tarnish Montcalm's otherwise stellar legacy. In the Last of the Mohicans film, based on the book of the same name, there is even a scene where he craftily incites a rogue Indian warrior to lead the massacre. Highly recommend the film, by the way. The fall of Fort William Henry was a turning point of the war. Previously, the colonial elite and the legislatures they sat in hadn't been incredibly committed to this war. But now Montcalm had won yet another victory, and the terrible massacre that occurred after shook them to their bones. Suddenly, mint julep drinking Southern planters, pious New Englanders, and rowdy New Yorkers would start taking this war a lot more seriously. They will still trade with the French and squabble with the British over cash, but they are going to begin cooperating with London more, and volunteers are going to start flooding in. For the first time, the 13 colonies are going to have a true shared experience and actually work together. It was the small beginnings of a shared American identity. But that was for the future. For now, Britain's dreams for North America seem to be in ruins, just like Fort William Henry. New blood, new tactics, and new commanders would be needed to stop the seemingly invincible Montcalm. Thank you for listening. To help the show grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In our next episode, we are taking a break from the main narrative and focusing on Rogers' Rangers. The first American Special Forces, they would take the fight to the hated French and their Indian allies frontier style, becoming legends in their own time and inspiring even today's Special Forces community. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.